is not about whether God exists or which religion is true. We are asking to imagine two different worlds, both filled with people who believe in a divine being. The central question in this debate is which vision of God creates a better, more meaningful, and more human world to live in. Our side believes that a world where God sometimes does wrong things is a world of greater freedom, moral growth, and accountability that reduces oppression and human suffering. This matters especially for believers and people of faith because the kind of God they believe in shapes how they live, love, and interpret pain. In our world, religious stories show that even divine beings can feel emotions or make mistakes. They are not perfect judges standing above humanity, but beings who experience similar struggles. In Greek mythology, the gods were powerful but imperfect, often showing jealousy, pride, and impulsiveness. These stories were not written to glorify cruelty, but to teach people that absolute powers can be dangerous and that even God should be questioned. Similarly, in the story of Jesus in the desert, he faced temptation, hunger, and exhaustion after fasting for 40 days. This moment showed that even someone divine could experience human weakness and moral conflict. These are not the stories that dominate the opposition world. In our world, God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and everything he does must be right, even if it feels unfair. That kind of God cannot be questioned, and when something cannot be questioned, it cannot be truly understood. This version of God creates distance between people and their faith. If God is perfect, untouchable, and beyond emotion, he becomes unrelatable. This removes the most important message. No, thank you. Behind all religions, the message of kindness, compassion, and empathy. Now, I'd like to move on to our team's main argument: why an imperfect God creates a more human and inspirational faith. When God is capable of mistakes, he becomes more human, and people can relate to him. Faith becomes a relationship based on understanding rather than fear. In our world, believers do not feel detached from God. They see his moments of error, doubt, or frustration and recognize that even divine beings experience the same emotion that humans feel. This makes faith stronger because people connect to a divine figure that mirrors their struggles rather than standing infinitely above them. It allows them to see goodness as something something that grows through effort, not only something only perfect beings can possess. In the opposition world, when tragedy strikes, believers often lose faith because they feel that God has betrayed them. If God is perfect and yet allows pain, people see this as a sign that he does not care. In our world, people understand that God can make mistakes. When terrible things happen, they do not immediately lose faith. Instead, they learn to forgive, to adapt, and to seek meaning in the experience. This creates a redemptive relationship between human and the divine, one that is based on reflection and healing rather than guilt or blind obedience. In our world, people take greater responsibility for their choices. They cannot simply justify actions by saying that God is always right. Instead, they must think critically and decide what is morally correct through reason and empathy. This makes morality more active and thoughtful. People recognize that their decision matters and that they have control over outcomes of their action. By contrast, the opposition world morally becomes passive. If God is always right, people stop questioning or reflecting. They justify harm, discrimination, or suffering by claiming that everything happens for a divine reason. This turns faith into a tool of control rather than a source of growth. In our world, people do not see imperfection as weakness. They understand it as a natural and necessary part of life. When people believe that even gods can make mistakes, they become less judgmental and more compassionate towards others. They view moral progress as a journey that includes errors and redemption. This understanding creates a culture of empathy and cooperation. People are kinder because they recognize the moral strength comes from continuous effort but not flawless obedience. The opposition may argue that our work creates confusion because morality loses a fixed point. However, morality already evolves with time as human societies learn and grow. Believing in an imperfect God allows that growth to occur honestly and openly. The worst case scenario for our side is that some individuals may lose belief in God entirely. Even that outcome is not harmful. When divine stories lose their meaning, people instead look to human moral role models who demonstrate kindness, fairness, and justice. Our team strongly believes that religion becomes more human, relatable, and inspiring when God is capable of error. A God who makes mistakes teaches that moral worth lies in not being perfect, but in the ability to grow, to forgive, and to improve. Faith in this world is not about worshiping perfection, but about finding strength through imperfection. And due to all these reasons, government should take the debate home, and I'm more than proud to propose.
I'm speaker number one of the opposition team, and we're sure to strongly fight for the world that would prefer God, who is always perfect. Let me start with a setup. Let's face it, God is perfect. God is a perfect example, and ideal has been a standard for a long as the world existed. Let's define God: a supreme divine believed to be a creator and a ruler of the universe, possessing an ultimate power, knowledge, and authority. God is viewed as the source of moral guidance, the origin of life, and the ultimate judge of right and wrong. By his very definition, God is perfect already. He cannot make mistakes. The proposition is trying to create a very strange, scary, painful world which will lead to chaos and nightmares. Our team will prove that it's crucial to humanity to remain in a world where God is perfect. Our team will address the benefits of a perfect God. This will provide moral certainty and inspiration, stability and safety, trust and faith, the elimination of unnecessary suffering, and a belief in ultimate wisdom. Let me begin with a rebuttal. The proposition is trying to make God seem more human, so we can be more reliable to them. But that we will judge less. They are trying to shape God as one human-like qualities. By this definition, wrong. The definition of God is a divine being, not a human being. So just with that alone, the argument fails. The argument cannot stand. No, ma'am. Argument cannot stand as we have one another as humans to relate to and be friends with. God, however, needs to remain divine and perfect. My first substantive is very important, which the proposition has not considered. A world of stability and safety. Mistakes, especially by God, could lead to chaos, suffering, or disasters. Perfection guarantees a stable and secure world. A world where God is always right ensures that the universe is consistent. Natural laws, social systems, and events that would unfold without sudden disasters caused by divine error. While such things do happen in our world, we can accept there's one perfect reason for this, and that it did not come from some silly mistake. This stability allows humans to plan, build societies, and pursue long-term goals with confidence, knowing that the foundation of reality is secure. Can you imagine the fear that people would have to endure if God makes mistakes? Imagine the situation. People would wake up in fear every morning, not knowing what to expect. They will go wondering every minute of every day whether or not God was going to make a mistake or not. They would have to keep guessing. A world where you have to keep guessing and live in a state of constant fear. No, thank you. No, sir. No, ma'am. Thank you. We would rather live in a world that we can rest in the comfort and courage that God there for us, so that God will be perfect and it will be for the best. My next substantive is that trust and faith, knowing God is perfect, allows humans to divine decisions completely, reducing doubt and anxiety. My explanation is that faith is the cornerstone of many religions. Knowing that God is perfect strengthens that trust. Humans can devote themselves as God's guidance without fear or being misled. Confidence is divine and wisdom is perfect. This fosters a deep sense of spiritual security and mental peace, as people are not burdened by the doubt or whether God's intentions or decisions might be burdened by flawed. A God is capable of error would create uncertainty and weaken the foundation of faith, making spiritual devotion more stressful and less meaningful. How do we trust someone who constantly makes mistakes? Yes, humans make mistakes. Of course, that's why we are human. By definition, God is the opposite. He's divine. He's perfect. We need to be able to have complete trust in God and to hold that trust throughout our lives. Not being able to trust someone is very unstable and scary. God is perfect and God is trust. Anything but the unthinkable. Therefore, this clearly shows that we should live in a world where God is always right. Thank you.
All of the benefits that the opposition claims rely on the assumption that an all-knowing and perfect God automatically creates a universal agreement on what is good or bad. This is not true. Society will always engage in moral debate, especially in areas where clear answers do not exist. History has repeatedly shown that the idea of a perfect God has been used to justify tragedies and oppression against marginalized groups. This demonstrates that divine perfection cannot be universally applied because individuals and cultures interpret morality differently. If the opposition wishes to defend a world with an absolutely perfect God, they must also explain how divine perfection could align with diverse moral beliefs without silencing those differences. Even if we accept their claim that a perfect God inspires a moral imitation, that inspiration often comes at the cost of a human freedom. In their world, people are taught that the only good life is one defined by strict obedience to scripture or religious authority. This allows religious institutions to abuse power and enforce rigid, unfair interpretations of faith. In contrast, our world, no thank you, in contrast, our world creates a more equal relationship between humanity and the divine. When God can sometimes be wrong, he becomes a moral partner rather than a distant ruler. Believers feel that God truly understands their pain and limitations because he also experiences imperfection. This understanding strengthens empathy and creates a more compassionate form of faith. Moving on to our team's last argument, which will be about war. No, thank you. Moral interpretation is more democratic and less abused by religious leaders. Our side does not argue that all religions are harmful. Please note that faith and spirituality can provide comfort, hope, and a sense of belonging. However, in the opposition's world, where God is always right, faith easily becomes a tool for abuse and control. When divine perfection is unquestionable, religious leaders gain unchecked moral authority. History shows that this concentration of power often leads to corruption, hypocrisy, and discrimination, not because religion itself is evil, but because absolute power without accountability consistently results in harm. In a world where God is believed to be perfect, religious authorities claim to be the closest interpreters of that perfection. This gives them moral monopoly, allowing them to decide what is correct or holy. They use guilt, fear, and shame to maintain control, and questioning their authority becomes equivalent to question God himself. The harm is very clear. When people are unable to question moral applications of divine will, religion stops being a guide for goodness and becomes a cage for obedience. Harmful traditions such as gender inequality, discrimination, and intolerance toward minorities remain unchallenged because believers are taught that these practices represent the will of God and must not be questioned. Two layers for this. Layer 1, democratization of morality and faith. In our world, moral authority becomes democratic. If God can sometimes be wrong, moral interpretation becomes open and participatory. Both believers and leaders must engage in discussion about what is right and just. Faith becomes adaptable and capable of reform, evolving with human understanding rather than being restricted by fear or tradition. Layer 2, accountability and institutional reform. Justice systems and religious organizations are also more accountable in our world. Without the ability to excuse wrongdoing as simply part of God's plan, institutions must justify their actions through fairness and rationality. Moral legitimacy is earned, not inherited through divine authority, and accountability becomes more likely because believers are encouraged to question and reflect. When God is not seen as universally correct, people have the space to evaluate whether divine actions are fair or mistaken. Critical thought becomes a moral duty rather than a sin, and questioning faith is treated as an act of responsibility rather than disobedience. Our world is also more pluralistic, and religious differences are no longer defined by competition over which God is more perfect or whose scripture is more divine. Instead, the conversation centers on shared moral lessons, mutual respect, and the recognition that all faiths and cultures can coexist despite imperfection. When societies accept that even divine beings can be erred, they become more tolerant of human difference. This openness reduces religious extremism and the moral absolutism that often divides communities. In our world, moral and spiritual growth are defined by participation, understanding, and accountability. Religion becomes a dialogue rather than an order, and people do not lose faith. They practice it with greater awareness and compassion. These are the reasons why we've never been so proud to propose. Thank you so much.
Judges and esteemed opponents. I am Speaker 2 of the opposition team, and I am here to prove that we would rather not live in a world where God makes mistakes. Let's face it, God is perfect. This is a fact. There is no use trying to imagine anything otherwise. Let's do rebuttals. The proposition is saying that God is equal to us humans. They also mention things like it is God's decision to cause problems like discrimination and other moral issues. They have ignored the basics of the characteristics of divine. This is what we are saying. All of these things are part of God's perfect plan already. Things will unfold according to His perfect plan and purpose. However, imagine their world. Imagine a world where on top of this, God makes mistakes too. On top of what we already have to deal with, which is what they have already listed, the proposition wants God to make mistakes on top of it all. They are going against the very definition of God, which is divine. He cannot be like humans, ever. Let's imagine a world that the proposition is proposing. Imagine a world where God keeps making mistakes. Imagine the suffering, pain, and chaos. If God is perfect, however, there would be no unnecessary suffering as a world where God never makes mistakes and avoids preventable pain, injustice, and hardship. Life is more fair and predictable. Let's face it, the world suffers through lies, sins, pollution, wars, many ways. But that is why the world needs a God that makes no wrong decisions. Why do we need Him to fix the world? To stop all the suffering. He would know what to do. How? As I explained, He always makes good decisions. Even if people cannot see it at the moment, in the long run, God's perfect decisions will make sense. Ever heard of the phrase, everything will work out in the end? Or the phrase, no thank you, ma'am. Ever heard of the phrase, everything will work out in the end? Or the phrase, in God's time? So yes, while there is suffering, God's perfection helps us to deal with it, knowing we can't trust Him. If God is always right, human suffering is never caused by divine mistakes. Pain and hardship will only occur as part of meaningful life lessons or natural consequences, not from preventable errors in judgment. This minimizes unnecessary suffering, injustice, or cruelty in the world, making life fairer and more human. A God who can make mistakes risks causing avoidable harm, leaving humans to endure suffering that is neither deserved nor instructive, which could erode trust in divinity and the fairness of existence. Moving on. What sort of inspiration would we get from a God who keeps making mistakes? Who do we turn to? Who will inspire us? We need a role model and we need an ideal to strive for rather than someone flawed. How do we follow such examples? Let me give you an example. If God does not make any mistakes, we will try to learn from him. In other words, inspired. I mean, won't you? Won't you be inspired as he... No, thank you, ma'am. As he does not make any mistakes and you want to try and be like him? Across religions, there has been historical evidence that God is real and perfect. So much religious and scientific evidence points to a God who does not do any wrong and is always right. A perfectly right God serves as the ultimate example of virtue, justice, and wisdom. Humans can aspire to emulate divine qualities, striving toward higher moral standards with clarity about what constitutes God's goodness. This provides an ideal to guide personal development and social behavior. Conversely, if God makes mistakes, humans may adopt flawed examples of morality, struggle to define what is truly right, and a lack of consistent standard to inspire ethical growth. A flawless model motivates humans to reach their full potential. We would rather not live in a world where God makes mistakes. Thank you.
At the end of this debate, the key question is not whether God exists, nor which religion is true. Both sides agree that people in both worlds believe in a divine being. The real issue is what kind of belief system creates a better moral world. One where morality is shared, reflective, and compassionate, or one where it's absolute, unquestionable, and rigid. Our stand stands for a world that is more human, inclusive, and capable of growth. A world where God sometimes does wrong things. This version of God produces more meaningful faith, more accountable institutions, and more resilient societies. The opposition, in contrast, defends a world that relies on a perfect God and a fixed moral order. But this leads to blind obedience, moral stagnation, and exploitation by those who claim to speak for divine authority. First, I'll move on to a comparative framing. What each world values. In the opposition world, morality is defined by perfection and obedience. They believe this produces stability and order. However, perfection is not the same as goodness. It removes the need for questioning and prevents humans from developing empathy and accountability. In our world, morality is defined by reflection and more responsibility. Faith is dynamic and participatory. People must think, evaluate, and decide what is rather than merely following what they are told. This makes our world not only fairer, but more kinder, because compassion comes from understanding imperfection, not from enforcing perfection. Second, I'll do one of our first rebuttals. One of our first rebuttals is all about on the opposition idea of moral clarity. The opposition claim that a perfect God creates moral clarity. However, moral clarity is not the same as moral correctness. Throughout history, claims of divine perfection have justified wars, discrimination, and suffering. Because of different cultures interpret divine will differently, moral clarity becomes fragmented, and those in power decide who the interpretation wins. This is why divine perfection becomes dangerous. It gives religious authorities the ability to silence opposition and frame discrimination as sin. Our rules solve this by allowing discussion and reinterpretation. When God can be wrong, it's become natural to question, reflect, and refine our understanding of morality. Third, I'll move on to extension, reframing the role of God in humanity. The government bench has shown that an imperfect God does not weaken faith, but strengthens it. When God can make mistakes, the relationship between humanity and divine becomes balanced. Believers do not see God as a distant ruler, but as a moral companion who understands struggle, doubt, and growth. In contrast, in the opposite world, tragedy destroys faith. If God is perfect and yet allows injustice, believers feel abandoned. When their perfect God fails to meet expectation, faith collapses entirely. Fourth, moving on to our second rebuttal. Our second rebuttal is all about on the opposition's claim of stability and order. The opposition says that their world provides stability, but stability without progress is stagnation. A world where no one questions divine action may appear peaceful, but a silence is necessary in moral conversations. That and silence enables the abuses by religious leaders, governments, and majorities who all claim to act in the name of a perfect God. In our world, there is more accountability and more diversity. Because people accept the divine will not always be correct, they hold institutions to higher human standards of fairness and reason. Finally, moving on to our clash. Which world better serves humanity? First, we serve faith and individual meeting. Our world allows faith to be personal, emotional, and resilient. People can love and worship God while still recognizing their role in shaping moral goodness. Their faith is based on growth and shared humanity, not on submission. Second, we provide a societal and institutional outcomes. In our world, religious institutions must justify their authority. They cannot hide behind their phrase, God is perfect. Their actions are open to scrutiny, which prevents corruption and promotes reform. In the opposition's world, perfection gives all cover abuse. Leaders can claim their actions beyond question, even when they harm others. This preserves inequality and intolerance rather than solving it. And finally, we provide human world development. Our world produces people who think critically, emphasize deeply, and understand that moral growth is a lifelong process. The world produces followers who obey without question. The difference between living morally and merely following moral orders. In conclusion, I have shared you some models, our team's clashes, and the exception of our belief. And therefore, for all of these reasons, I am so proud to propose.
Honorable judges and highly esteemed opponents. I'm Speaker 3 of the opposition, and I'm here to prove that we should live in a world where God is always right, just as it is right now. Our team has already painted a picture for you all about what can happen if we have a God that makes mistakes. The uncertainty and fear are unthinkable. Let me begin with some rebuttals. We have to address this. Why does the proposition keep repeating that this debate is not about whether we believe in God or not? We never mentioned this at all in our motion breakdown. This is not about belief. This is about whether a God should be perfect or not. They need to focus on the outcomes of what they are proposing. So far, all they have mentioned is relatability, that being imperfect is okay, that God should be more human, etc., etc., etc. They have not addressed how this connects to the definition of God being divine. They have not answered our questions about how much worse the world will become if God suddenly wakes up in day out and makes mistakes. How will we live each day in day out and makes mistakes? How will we in fear and uncertainty? They have to address these concerns. Right now, this debate is about which is better for us. A world where we can rely on God, or one in which we are constantly shaking in fear, not knowing what is going to happen that day. Let's begin. We need moral certainty, period. A perfectly right God ensures clear moral guidance. Humans have a reliable standard for justice, ethics, and decisions. For example, when you know that God makes no mistakes, you would model him as the prime example that humans should look towards and act. This will allow humans to provide clear and just rules to correct those who make mistakes. This would prevent crimes, as the people would naturally try to avoid these harsh punishments. We need God as a role model for this, not one who keeps committing these mistakes along with us. In a world where God is always right, humans have a clear, unwavering standard for morality and ethics. Every command, law, or guidance is inherently just and reliable, leaving no ambiguity about what is right or wrong. This certainty allows societies to function more smoothly because people can trust that following God's principles leads to fairness and order. Without the risk of divine mistakes, humans are spared the confusion or conflict that arises when moral rules are inconsistent. In contrast, if God could make mistakes, people struggle to discern the true ethical path, leading to doubt, disagreement, and moral chaos. Now moving on to our final argument, which is that we need a source of ultimate wisdom. A perfectly right God embodies complete wisdom, ensuring that actions benefit humans even if they cannot immediately see it. A God who is always right embodies complete wisdom, meaning every decision is made with full knowledge of the present and future consequences. Humans often act impulsively or with limited understanding, resulting in mistakes that cause harm and suffering. In a world where God is infallible, even difficult or seemingly unfair events are part of a perfect plan designed for the best possible outcomes. This ultimate wisdom ensures that humans benefit in ways they might not immediately recognize, fostering trust in divine guidance. In contrast, a God who errs might unintentionally create harm, suffering, or injustice, undermining the very purpose of divinity as a source of guidance and protection. Our arguments come from our hearts and for the well-being of all mankind. Judge and our dear opponents, we have to live in a world where God is perfect. We just have to. The alternative is madness, sadness, chaos, and absolute nightmare. We need a God who is perfect as our guide, our solace, our role model, our teacher, our perfect light. This has been a pleasure to debate, and we are proud to be the opposition. Thank you.
The proposition wants God and humans to be the same. They just want a world where God is relatable and it is okay for him to just make mistakes from time to time. We really need to paint this picture for the proposition step by step, one last time. Let me paint this by strokes. First stroke, the world is already painful. There is suffering as is. There is trouble and pain. We know this. We accept this. Second stroke, God is imperfect and makes mistakes. Can I even paint this stroke? This wouldn't be a stroke. It will be a dangerous splatter. The painting would lose focus. It would become a total mess. Third stroke. Sorry, there isn't one. We can't undo the damage. However, back to our side. The idea that God and humans have equal power and standing is fundamentally flawed because it ignores the very nature of divinity. God is traditionally understood as omnipotent, while humans are limited and imperfect. Treating them as equals would blur the line between creator and creation, undermining moral authority and moral order. There are two worlds here, ladies and gentlemen. Let me propose them. Proposition's world. In an already scary world, which they mentioned, right? They said we have a world of discrimination, pain, and suffering. But now they want a God who makes mistakes on top of it all. We will live in fear and uncertainty every single day on top of what we already have to deal with. Our world. In a world that is already scary, again, as the proposition said, it is already a struggle. But this time, we can trust in a God who is a role model, who is perfect, who doesn't make any mistakes. So we can rest in the belief that no matter what is happening, there is a perfect reason, there is a perfect plan, there is a perfect purpose. A world in which God does not make mistakes brings comfort and stability to the human race, which is the very definition of the divine. Thank you.
Of the day, our team has proven to you on why we should live in a world where God is imperfect, and the reasons are that if God is so perfect, it's like out of the world. Then the humans won't be able to connect. They will just look up and they'll just think. And even if the God is their role model, they will be discouraged with the fact that is impossible to be just like God because in their world, God is perfect. However, in our world, God is not perfect, and humans can have and worship gods as their role model. But I don't mean that they will be exactly like gods. And if that happens, God can punish them because God still has some power. And now I would like to point out some parts that the opposition team has made mistakes. They said that if God is perfect, then humans will have to do nothing and just rest. But that means we will lose thinking of our own. Because the God will just do everything for us. We don't need to think. We don't need to do anything. We just live our normal lives, and that will definitely not be beneficial for us. They also said that the mistake by God can destroy the world. However, if the gods are like humans, they're just more wise. Then if humans make a mistake, it doesn't impact the world that much. So if a god is like a human but with a bit more power and wisdom, his mistake won't have that much of an effect either. And also, they said that God always makes good decisions. However, if you look back in the history and the myths, there are some gods that have made mistakes and have been punished. So this is not true. And our team already told you. Our team already told you that God has to relate to in order to rule well. So the God has to feel the emotions that people are feeling, so that the God can be a good role model and support them well. And due to all these reasons, government should take the debate home, and I'm more than proud to propose.